Welcome, friends, to another discussion where we try to look past the headlines, past the screaming matches on your television screens, and get to the root economic realities that are actually shaping our lives. What I want to talk to you about today is something that is being presented to you in the mainstream press as a political drama, a clash of personalities, a feud between Donald Trump and Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney. You see the insults, you see the tweets, you see the threats of tariffs, but if you stop there, if you only look at the theater of it, you are missing the profound historical shift that is taking place right underneath our feet. This is not just about two men. This is about the decline of an empire, the desperate flailing of a fading economic hegemon, and the inevitable reaction of the rest of the world to that decline. What we are witnessing between the United States and Canada right now is a textbook example of what happens when a dominant imperial power can no longer offer stability or prosperity to its subordinates and instead resorts to naked coercion. And as we are seeing, that coercion is failing. It is failing because the material conditions of the global economy have changed, and the United States is no longer the only game in town. Let us look at the specifics, because the details here matter enormously. On January 20th, 2026, in Davos, Switzerland, that gathering place of the global capitalist elite, Mark Carney stood up and said something very revealing. He said, "Middle powers must act together, because if you are not at the table, you are on the menu." Now think about that phrase. It is a recognition, stark and clear, that the old arrangement where the United States sat at the head of the table and everyone else gratefully accepted the crumbs is over. Carney was signaling that countries like Canada, which for decades have been locked into a dependent economic relationship with the United States, can no longer rely on American benevolence. They know that in the current era of American instability, with its erratic leadership and its aggressive America First protectionism, they are at risk of being devoured. Trump, who was there, heard this, and his reaction was exactly what you would expect from a leader who believes that economic dominance is a birthright rather than something that must be maintained through productive relationships. He lashed out. He disinvited Canada from his so-called Board of Peace. He threatened 100% tariffs. He started calling the prime minister of a sovereign nation governor, a deliberate colonial insult intended to remind Canada that in his mind they are nothing more than the 51st state, a resource colony for American industry. But here is where the story deviates from the script of the last 75 years. Usually, when the United States threatens a neighbor, the neighbor folds, the neighbor apologizes, the neighbor makes concessions to preserve access to the vast American consumer market. But Carney did not flinch. He did not apologize. When Trump claimed that Canada lives because of the United States, Carney shot back that Canada thrives because we are Canadian. And then he called Trump's bluff. He went on television and said the threats were bluster. He publicly contradicted the U.S. Treasury Secretary. He called the President of the United States a liar, essentially, in front of the entire world. Now, why would he do that? Is it because he is brave? Is it because he is reckless? No. It is because he has looked at the numbers. He has done the economic calculus that Trump, in his vanity, refuses to do. The United States and Canada trade over $1.9 billion worth of goods every single day. Let that number sink in, $2 billion every single day crossing that border. Canada is the top export destination for 34 U.S. states, not China, not Mexico, Canada. When Trump threatens to slap a 100% tariff on Canadian goods, he is not threatening Canada. He is holding a gun to the head of the American economy and threatening to pull the trigger. Let me explain to you how tariffs actually work, because the politicians will lie to you about this until the end of time. A tariff is not a tax paid by a foreign government. It is a tax paid by the importer, which is then passed on to the consumer. If you put a 100% tariff on Canadian lumber, Canadian steel, or Canadian oil, it is the American home builder, the American auto manufacturer, and the American driver who pays the bill. Canada supplies 63% of all crude oil imported into the United States. That is nearly 1.5 billion barrels a year. Do you understand what happens to the price of gasoline in the United States if that supply is taxed at 100%? It doesn't go up by a few cents. It spikes, it explodes, and it happens within weeks. The entire U.S. automotive industry, which is deeply integrated with Canadian supply chains, where a single car part might cross the border 6 or 7 times before the car is finished, would grind to a halt. Factories in Michigan, in Ohio, in Tennessee would shut down because they cannot afford the steel and aluminum coming from Ontario and Quebec. So when Carney calls Trump's bluff, he is doing so with the knowledge that Trump cannot destroy the Canadian economy without simultaneously blowing up his own. It is a relationship of mutual destruction, and Carney knows it. But there is a second, even more important layer to this. While Trump is screaming about tariffs and insults, Canada is quietly, methodically diversifying its portfolio. This is the part that should terrify the American ruling class. On January 16th, Carney went to Beijing. He did exactly what Washington has spent the last decade warning its allies not to do. He made a deal with China. He agreed to let 49,000 Chinese electric vehicles into Canada at a reduced tariff rate, 6.1%, down from 100%. In exchange, China dropped its retaliatory tariffs on Canadian canola and other agricultural products. Now, look at the brilliance of this maneuver from a capitalist strategic perspective. The United States has walled itself off from Chinese EVs, determined to protect its domestic auto industry from competition it cannot handle. But Canada says, no, we will take the cheap, high-quality EVs. We will let our consumers have access to this technology. And in doing so, they unlock a massive market for their farmers. This deal opens up $7 billion in export markets for Canadian agriculture. It saves the Canadian canola farmer who was being crushed by the trade war. And what was Trump's reaction? This is the most telling part of all. At first, he praised it. He said, if you can get a deal with China, you should do that. He didn't understand what had happened. He thought it was just a business deal. But then, 5 days later, after Carney's speech in Davos, after the realization set in that this was a political pivot away from the U.S., Trump panicked. He reversed course. He threatened the tariffs again. Why? Because he realized that Canada was building a coalition of middle powers to counterbalance the United States. Carney is not just talking to China. He is negotiating with India. He is talking to the ASEAN nations in Southeast Asia. He is talking to Mercosur in South America. He is bragging about striking 12 new trade deals on 4 continents in 6 months. This is the nightmare scenario for American imperialism, a world where its allies stop waiting for permission, a world where countries like Canada, long taken for granted as the quiet neighbor in the attic, decide that they have other options. You have to understand this in the context of the history of capitalism. Capitalism is a global system. It seeks markets everywhere. For the last century, the United States was the guarantor of that system. It provided the currency, the military protection, and the consumer market of last resort. But as the U.S. economy becomes more financialized, more unequal, and more politically dysfunctional, It is losing its ability to play that role. It is becoming a predator rather than a protector. Trump's America First is simply the explicit admission of this reality. It is the United States saying, we will cannibalize our allies if we have to in order to keep our own bubble inflated. But the allies are not stupid. They see the writing on the wall. They see a crumbling infrastructure in America. They see a political system paralyzed by polarization. They see a debt that is spiraling out of control. And they look at China, they look at the emerging economies of the global south, and they say, we need a hedge. We need an insurance policy against the collapse of the American empire. Mark Carney's actions are the rational response of a national bourgeoisie trying to survive the decline of its patron. He is not a radical. He is a banker. He is a man of the establishment. And that is what makes this so significant. If it were a socialist leader doing this, you could dismiss it as ideology. But this is the former head of the Bank of England. This is a man who breathes the air of high finance. When he decides that the United States is too risky a partner to rely on exclusively, you know that the structural rot has gone deep. The threat of tariffs, this blunt instrument that Trump loves to wave around, is losing its power because the world is adapting. The supply chains are shifting. The decoupling that Washington talks about is happening, but not in the way they intended. They thought they could isolate China. Instead, they are isolating themselves. They are pushing their closest allies into the arms of their rivals. If we are going to understand where this confrontation between the United States and Canada is heading, we have to pull the camera back even further and look at the structural arrangements that supposedly govern trade in North America. I'm talking about the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, the USMCA. This is the deal that Trump himself negotiated, signed, and celebrated as one of his great accomplishments. It replaced NAFTA and was sold to the American public as a tough modern agreement that put America first. But like so much in capitalist politics, the rhetoric and the reality do not line up. The USMCA was always a compromise. It locked in integrated supply chains. It protected certain corporate interests on all sides of the border. It built in arbitration mechanisms and dispute panels precisely to prevent one country from unilaterally detonating the entire arrangement with wild tariffs. Why? Because the capitalist classes in all three countries wanted predictability. They wanted to know that investments in factories, in pipelines, in rail infrastructure would not be wiped out overnight by a political tantrum. So when Trump threatens 100% tariffs on Canadian goods, he is not only threatening Canadian exporters, he is threatening the legal architecture that his own corporate backers depend on. He is signaling to global capital that contracts signed with the United States may not be worth the paper they are written on. That is poison for an empire. Empires run on trust, however hypocritical that trust may be. Investors must believe that the rules, once set, will be roughly obeyed or they will take their money elsewhere. And that is exactly what we are starting to see. When Carney calls Trump's bluff, he is not just playing personal politics. He is invoking the very agreement Trump championed. He knows that for the United States to follow through on a full-scale tariff war with Canada would invite a flood of lawsuits, arbitration cases, and retaliatory measures, not only from Canada, but from multinational corporations blindsided by the chaos. It would be a legal and economic quagmire. This is why you are seeing such a disconnect between the bombast on television and the relative caution in actual policy. The threats are maximalist: 100% tariffs, decertifying airplanes, shutting down energy flows. But the follow-through is constrained because the capitalist system has tangled itself in a web of mutual dependencies. Those dependencies were profitable when everything was humming along. They allowed corporations to play workers in different countries against each other to chase the lowest wages and the weakest regulations. That was the entire point of free trade from the standpoint of capital. But those same interdependencies now act as a brake on nationalist adventurism. If you pull too hard on one thread, the whole fabric tears. What Carney has grasped and what Trump either cannot or will not see is that this interdependence gives the so-called middle powers leverage they did not have before. 50 years ago, if Washington demanded obedience from Ottawa, there were few alternatives. The global financial system, the security architecture, the commodity flows were all overwhelmingly dominated by the United States and its closest allies. But now, in a world where China is the largest trading partner for more and more countries, where India is growing, where regional blocs in Asia, Africa, and Latin America are forming their own institutions, that monopoly is gone. The U.S. remains powerful, of course, but not unchallengeable. When Canada signs a deal with China, when it opens negotiations with India and ASEAN and Mercosur, it is effectively saying we will not allow ourselves to be a single client state of Washington. We will construct multiple escape hatches. From a Marxian perspective, what we are witnessing is the reconfiguration of the world market as the center of gravity shifts away from a single imperial core toward a more multipolar arrangement. But do not misunderstand me. This is not the emergence of some humane, worker-friendly global order. It is still capitalism. Canadian capitalists, Chinese capitalists, Indian capitalists, they all share the same basic objective: to exploit labor, to accumulate profit, to dominate markets. What is changing is not the class structure, but the balance of power within that structure. The American capitalist class, long accustomed to dictating terms, now finds itself bargaining, sometimes begging. It hates this, it resents it, and it expresses that resentment through political figures like Trump, who promise to restore a past glory that can no longer exist under current material conditions. The tragedy is that working people are being recruited into this intra-capitalist fight as foot soldiers. American workers are told that Canadian or Chinese workers are their enemies. Canadian workers are told to fear American retaliation. Chinese workers are painted as a faceless, threatening mass. All the while, the real conflict, the class conflict, is obscured. When Trump threatens tariffs, he frames it as a defense of American jobs. When Carney diversifies trade, he frames it as protecting Canadian prosperity, but neither of them challenges the underlying reality that workers in all these countries are dependent on wages that barely keep up with rising costs, are burdened by debt, and are excluded from the decision-making that shapes their economic lives. The negotiations we have been discussing, whether in Davos, Beijing, or Washington, do not include workers' councils, unions with veto power, or democratic assemblies of citizens. They are meetings of elites, by elites, for elites. Think for a moment about the Canadian farmer whose canola exports were blockaded by Chinese tariffs because Canada had followed U.S. trade policy. That farmer did not decide to join Washington's crusade against Beijing. That was a decision made by politicians and diplomats operating in the interests of their dominant industries and their geopolitical strategies. Yet when the retaliation came, it was that farmer whose livelihood was threatened. Now, when Carney makes a deal to reopen that market, the same farmer is supposed to feel grateful to a government that put him in the line of fire in the first place. This is the absurdity of capitalist trade wars. Ordinary people are treated as expendable chips in a high-stakes game they did not choose to play. The same is true for the auto workers in the United States and Canada. For decades, they watched as their jobs were moved, their unions weakened, their wages stagnated, all in the name of competitiveness and efficiency. The integrated supply chains were not built to serve them. They were built to serve corporate shareholders. Now, when those chains become a constraint on nationalist maneuvering, when a 100% tariff would destroy billions in invested capital and wipe out thousands of jobs, we are told this shows how interdependent and cooperative our economies are. But cooperation between corporations is not the same as solidarity among workers. It is coordination among exploiters who have discovered that some degree of stability is in their own interest. So where does this leave us in terms of the US-Canada confrontation? If you listen only to the headlines, you might think we are on the brink of a catastrophic rupture, trade wars, energy blockades, decertified airplanes. In reality, what we are more likely to see is a messy, drawn-out period of brinkmanship, symbolic retaliations, partial climb-downs, and backroom compromises. Trump will claim victory regardless of the outcome. That is his style. Carney will present any stabilization as proof that he protected Canadian sovereignty. The USMCA will not be formally scrapped overnight. Instead, it will be chipped away at the margins by exceptions, side agreements, and loopholes. The global media will frame each twist and turn as a drama of personalities. But the deeper story will be the gradual erosion of unquestioned American dominance and the parallel failure of any alternative power center to offer a fundamentally different economic logic. I want to be very clear here. The decline of an empire does not automatically mean the rise of something better. The Roman Empire's collapse did not usher in egalitarian democracy, it led to feudal fragmentation. The weakening of British hegemony did not end colonial exploitation, it simply shifted the commanding heights to Washington and Wall Street. Similarly, the partial decline of US power we are now witnessing could very well produce a more chaotic, more dangerous world, not a more just one. Competing capitalist blocs can be even more ruthless with their populations when they feel threatened. Trade wars can escalate into currency wars, which can spill into real wars. We should not romanticize multipolarity. It is an opportunity, not a guarantee. The opportunity lies in the cracks that open up when old structures fail. As American influence recedes and its ability to dictate economic policy to others diminishes, there is a space, small but real, for alternative visions to emerge. Those alternatives will not come from the Mark Carneys or the Donald Trumps of the world. They will come, if they come at all, from organized movements of workers, farmers, students, and communities who refuse to be cannon fodder in trade disputes. They will come from people who look at a situation like this and say, no, we will not choose between American capital and Canadian capital, or between Washington and Beijing. We want a different system altogether. Imagine for a moment what a genuinely democratic trade policy would look like. Before signing a deal with China, the Canadian government would have to present the details to a binding referendum among workers and farmers whose livelihoods are on the line. Before threatening tariffs on Canadian goods, the U.S. government would be required to obtain the consent of auto workers, truckers, and refinery employees whose jobs depend on that trade. Panels of randomly selected citizens, what the ancient Athenians might have recognized as sortition, would review the proposals, call expert witnesses, and deliberate publicly. Unions would not be spectators. They would be co-authors of the policy. That kind of arrangement sounds utopian only because we have become accustomed to the idea that economic decisions belong to a tiny minority of owners and their political representatives. The US Canada tensions we have been examining are, in the end, a symptom of a deeper disease, the separation of economic power from democratic control. Whether the empire is rising or falling, whether the hegemon is Washington or Beijing, as long as the mass of people have no say in how production and distribution are organized, crises like this will recur. The names will change, the alliances will shift, but the underlying insecurity, the precarity, the sense of being at the mercy of forces beyond our control will remain. That is why, as a Marxian economist, I insist that we cannot stop at criticizing this or that leader, this or that trade deal. We have to ask who owns, who decides, who benefits. We have to challenge the very organization of the workplace, where most of us spend the majority of our waking lives obeying orders and institutions that look nothing like the democracies we claim to believe in. So, as you watch the headlines about Trump threatening tariffs, about Carney signing deals, about China and India and all the rest, I urge you to keep two levels of analysis in mind. On the surface, yes, there is a power struggle between states, a reconfiguration of the global hierarchy. It matters, and it will have real consequences for prices, jobs, and stability. But beneath that surface, there is a more enduring struggle between those who own and control the means of production and those who must sell their labor to survive. The former are repositioning themselves for a new era of global competition. The latter are, for the most part, being dragged along without consultation. We cannot prevent empires from rising and falling. That seems to be a recurring feature of class societies. But we can decide whether we will allow the next phase of history to be written by the same small group that wrote the last one. The confrontation between the United States and Canada, the humiliation of Trump by a smaller middle power, the quiet deals with China and others, these are all signals that the old order is cracking. The question before us is whether we will simply watch as spectators while a new configuration of capitalist power takes its place, or whether we will seize this moment of disruption to demand something profoundly different, an economy run not for the profits of the few, but for the needs of the many. That is the challenge this trade conflict poses if we are willing to see it.